This film is about the history of 6 women: Anna, Elizabeth, Millie, Romana, Rose, and Susan, whose names may not appear in textbooks, but whose lives draw a map of survival, resistance, and legacy among the land of flowers, known as Florida. With thousands of waterways that empty into the ocean, these women journeyed thousands of miles, pathways through nature's dangerous outback to secure safety and freedom. How many little black and brown girls today know about the 1791 slave uprising on the island of Saint-Domingue, what we now know as Haiti? How many were taught that the same nation that helped fund the American Revolution, France, only abolished slavery briefly because of those initial events in Haiti? The world order seemed to shift. Among those who lived through the flames of the revolution was a young woman named Romana Jacobo. Details about the life of Romana Jacobo are few before marrying George Biassou. He was an enslaved man and became one of the architects of the Haitian Revolution. Romana's brother, Juan George, was also a soldier and joined Biassou. Romana had a front seat to history, as her husband negotiated with the French and Spanish kings and military generals, choosing to cultivate a band of caudillos, or fighters, for Charles IV of Spain against the new French Republic. Romana, George, his closest soldiers, and their families came ashore in St. Augustine in 1796 with the new knowledge of freedom and all the baggage of war.
Écrit journal 5. Nous campons encore devant yon porte fermée. Fois ça, nèg nous frappé, c'est nan kay yon zami qui te ka refusé nous entrer. Nous comprenons, place ça assez relativement sans gagner civilisation. Mais nous pourrons communiquer avec moun qui sorti dans l'autre nation qui te immigré dans Saint-Augustine. Dans partie Floride Panyol qui te sorti dans l'autre bord de la mer ou soit échappé sud-sud. Sorti dans colonie Révélation yo. Li te goumé dans Britannique. Yo créé nouveau nation ça a yo relèl États-Unis d'Amérique. Principe encore basé sur liberté individuelle. Possession, propriété et poursuite des contingements.
Anna Maji Jean Jahi was born into a ruling family in Senegal, Africa in 1793 at the height of the Haitian Revolution and the year King Louis XVI and his family were executed in France, the year the French monarchy fell. Anna was captured in a raid following religious wars and land disputes in Jollof. She was sold into slavery and presented for purchase in 1806 Cuba. She arrives in East Florida as a pregnant teen and is thrust into a series of world events.
Susan and I spoke about the place I built for myself across from Laurel Grove, the plantation along the St. Johns River to which I was brought when I was just 13. I was so young when Zephaniah bought me as a slave on the Cuban docks and took me as his wife. I was pregnant when we reached the shores of Northeast Florida. 1 year after Zephaniah emancipated me, I moved to Horse Landing on the west side of the St. Johns River to gain space and the autonomy I needed. I continued to run many of Zephaniah's affairs as he often traveled by ship to many places. Seminole uprisings became more and more dangerous. a group attacked Laurel Grove and took 40 slaves and killed 2 of our most devoted. I first met Susan when we fled our homes to save our families during the 1812 Patriot War. Laurel Grove became a fort for the Georgia bandits. They terrorized us, stole slaves, and consumed all our supplies. Zephaniah was captured initially and pledged to support the rebel cause. He then disappeared, leaving me to coordinate the escape of my children, which I did with the help of a Spanish gunboat captain, Jose Antonio Moreno. At 21 years old, I devised a plan to torch both Laurel Grove and Horse Landing to deprive the thieves of a place to hide and ensure Spanish protection for my family. Eventually, I received a plot of land from Spanish authorities for burning our properties to defeat the bandit patriots, and the U.S. government paid our family damages for losses during those raids.
Rose, whose surname Purpal was assigned to her as an enslaved worker of the Purpal plantation of East Florida, learned that Britain offered terms of freedom to Africans escaping slavery. Civil war was coming between Native American Creeks. The Apalachicola River was the western boundary of Spain's East Florida territory and the location of busy trading posts. The British were coordinating strategic attacks against the Americans at the new fort to be built as part of the expansion of the War of 1812.
I was born in 1792, and at 22 years old, my husband Boswan and I decided we must escape the plantation in East Florida in the summer of 1814. We heard a group of Negro and an Indian were gathered near Pensacola and along the Appalachian River when the promise of the freedom from the British. We planned for carefully during the fall to leave. A man named Woodbine, who said he served as a captain in the Royal Canadian Marines, met us along the Halifax River in winter. It was cold and very dark as a number of us escaped, including our 2 children, Sally and Boyers. We filled the small boat quickly, pushing off into the river. We arrived after a week at the post and called Prospect Bluff. As we walked through the forest, we saw what loomed above us. 4 ramparts were hauled for cannons and a fortified embankment with a large gate and a soldier drilled in the yards. There was many homes scattered around the fort, mud huts for family, and field and planted area a few hundred feet. Boswan agreed to join the troop as a soldier. Claudia Nicholas promised freedom to us for Boswan military service. Boswan trained with other free Negroes and a group of Creek Seminole warriors allying against the Americans.
Elizabeth Newton was born a free Creole woman and lived among a group of Seminoles. Elizabeth and her family also heard about the British fort known as Prospect Bluff. The Newton family names are recorded in British commissary documents in 1814 when they arrived at the fort and nearby trading post to receive supplies. Conflicts from westward expansion, Southeast U.S. treaty negotiations, and the Creek Civil War led to famine for many in the region.
I've been born in 1793 in Northwest Florida, where I lived most of my life as a free Negro woman. I lived with another free Negro man named Ben Sims. We live as man and woman among the Indians. My oldest child is Richard, and my youngest is Ben. Ben been born in 1810, and then my daughter, Marianne and Lucinda, been born. My husband died just before I let Ben go with Captain Mott of New Providence, Bahamas, as a cabin boy. That's been the best way, I thought, for being to travel away from our area, which been too dangerous for we. We know Captain Mark frequently travel between Florida and the Bahamas. Boatmen recklessly that a Captain James had come aboard Mark's ship, take band, travel to Cuba, where he sailed band into slavery.
Millie Francis was born in 1803 to Josiah Francis and Polly Moniac, prominent Creeks of European and American Indian heritage in Alabama's Creek Territory. By 1812, Millie's father became known as Hillis Hadjo, warrior of crazy medicine. He declared that his people must return to original Creek traditions, and he became the leader of the Red Sticks, leading a faction of the Creek Civil War. Millie was only a child when she and her family fled Alabama, the base of the Red Stick movement, pursued by the Americans and a group of Creeks opposed to Millie's father's views. The Red Sticks requested British support to coordinate battle against the expansion of American territories and fight Creek rivals. The British received the Red Stick request, and military boats and troops arrived with supplies, fortifying the fort at Prospect Bluff.
I was 10 years old when we left in canoes on the Alabama River. We took only the clothes we were wearing. We left our holy ground behind. One group of Red Sticks escaped with us, but many broke away from my father as we went different ways. We did not eat for weeks as we ran. Our future was dark. Once a strong supporter of my father, William Weatherford, now pursued him with Choctaw warriors, including McIntosh, with the Americans. Weatherford participated in negotiating the surrender of those in the woods around Holy Ground who remained loyal to the Red Stick movement. We continued our journey to Florida, then under Spanish rule. Rumors of my father's death preceded us. Many of us were very sick when we reached the swamps near Pensacola in June of 1814. The Spanish governor and the British heard of us and sent friendly Seminoles to find us. We were hiding and starving in the swamps. My father sailed ahead of us to the post on the Apalachicola River. We walked on foot to join him. Many people died, and we buried them where they died.
Susan July's birth date in the new Florida Territory is uncertain, but she was childbearing age by 1840 when she met and married John Kawaya, as the Seminoles called him. Susan was born into a well-respected Scout family of African heritage located in the Alachua region, which encompassed the Tampa Bay area. John and Kawakoji, son of two privileged Miko Seminole chief families, both fought against the U.S. forces during the Second Seminole War. John and Susan traveled to Oklahoma's Indian Territory as conditions worsened in Florida.
After we make our way to Oklahoma's Indian Territory, John meets Guakuji. It means wildcat. At Deep Fork, where Chief Micanopy established a place for the Seminole families. Wildcat Guakuji is the son of Imathala. They know him as King Philip of the Seminoles, who escaped with John from the St. Augustine prison just before the Battle of Lake Okeechobee. John returns to Florida and again to interpret the American request for Seminoles to give up. We living in changing ways, our ways.
Romana's arrival in St. Augustine over 30 years earlier was auspicious. Declarations of freedom from Saint Domingue alarmed some Spanish Florida settlers as Romana's brother married into the free African family who would leave an impact in that community for decades.
Écrit journal numéro 6. Sans date. Gouverneur espagnol, Juan Nepomuceno de Quesada, te approuvé nous pour aller bon la mer Saint-Augustin. Pendant nous passer tout peuple là, sous waf yo ak nan la ri ya, yo te agi surprise pour yo wè George nan uniforme ak tout déclaration militaire li, ak tout médaille yo sou li. Li nan 50 li kounya. E li kembe un pile fouet. Mais en même temps, il est très fatigué. Gouverneur a te promettre la kembe promettre droit pour continuer l'agence aller George avec bénéfice auxiliaire noyo. Même si ça tout, c'est même Lia qui te bail George mauvais gens. Pour nous te manger dîner la caille à famille, lui imposer ça. Pour tout le monde, pour dire à toute famille, pas venir la caille, c'était un gros soufflet pour George. George lui-même fait connaissance avec Juan Batista Whitten. Moun ici a relé le prince, un esclave lagué qui vient en membre de Macoute Moun Noir à bataille contre la France au Creole, Floride. Prince Madame ni établi Léon solide dans la communauté et puis yo se marraine à parraine en pile ti moun dans ville là. Tout ça yo fait avec succès. Et yo gen foi en pile pour tout ça yo fait. Petite fille prince là, relé Rafaela. Il pral marié avec frère Juan George. Non, belle cérémonie, mariage extravagant. Nous ka ouais. Plus moun accepte nous ici, vraiment. Mais c'est seulement 100 moun qui lague noir, qui représente nous en dedans Saint-Augustin. Met esclave yo, gade nous ak découtance. Seulement peut-être yo wè nous comme mauvais exemple pour tout le monde dans même classe nous.
As a young mother, Ana took refuge with the Spanish after burning all she owned during the Patriot War. She likely heard about the Whitten, Jacobo, and Biasu family events, but not until years later.
Zephaniah arrived in December 1813 to where we stayed with the Spanish military at Fernandina. I continued with Zephaniah in 1814 to Fort George Island, a place once owned by the leader of the Patriot Raiders, McIntosh. We built a village and series of gardens on this island. It is beautiful, with many places for my two girls to roam near abandoned indigo fields, flowering hills, and an abandoned Spanish mission. 10 years passed since our family stayed at the Spanish fort, St. Nicholas, awaiting the time when the bandits would leave. My oldest son grew and learned trade and skills. but Zephaniah spends more time with other wives. At 31 years old, I gave birth to John Maxwell. Zephaniah was 60 years old, and he was appointed by President James Monroe to serve on East Florida's Territorial Council. Florida was an American territory, and color lines were deepening. Zephaniah became concerned about our welfare and our assets in Florida. He traveled to the northern states to abolitionist rallies and meetings to understand the changes coming when Florida becomes a state, which is just a matter of time. He heard that the island of freedom, Haiti, was a place where perhaps there will be less violence and uncertainty. Zephaniah heard from the Seminoles, friendly with the Spanish and very skeptical of American agreements, that the Indians intend to fight the new Florida territory and stop their removal to the west. Zephaniah decides we must leave for Haiti now.
Rose and her husband Botswana decide to leave Prospect Bluff as the War of 1812 ends and the British retreat.
All the Negroes at the fort sense a change in our safety as the British troops plan for their departure. And the Indian ally left a group heading to their territory across Florida and beyond. Captain Woodbine gave all those remaining at the fort an option to travel by ship to a different British port where slavery is forbidden, or remain behind at the fort to wait for Nichols to return. Both Swan and I decided to leave, and we boarded a British vessel for the Bermuda guided by Captain White and set sail for Florida in early 1815. We arrived at Nassau Harbor in June to restock the ship. We know Mr. Pompeo had many connections, and we afraid he would receive information that our ship had been held for Bermuda with a slave who had been at the Prospect Bluff. He sent word for his brother John, who worked a plantation in the Bahamas, to obtain permission to board the ship once we anchor.
Elizabeth's first husband was probably killed at Prospect Bluff after American and Creek allies destroyed the fort. She and her children somehow escaped and went south to the Suwannee River location of Nerostown, led by an African man who had ties to Prospect Bluff, located near Bolick Settlement, chief of the Alachua Seminoles Oconee line.
We moved place to place by boat in 1820 in Florida, the year that Lil Ben disappeared. An Indian civil war had gone, but we still been at risk. I tried to find information about Ben, but there been so much conflicting story. I began living with a man named Joe McNeil, and we decide we must leave Florida, as we hear more Indian war been possible and more white been coming. Our freedom been uncertain. We set out for Andros Island in the Bahamas with my oldest son and daughter on a sloop called Friend, commanded by Captain Pierce. By 1835, we hear story of renewed Seminole and Creek War in Florida, and I glad to be one of a few women on Andros. I own my own property in my own name.
Millie stayed at Prospect Bluff briefly until her father departs with Colonel Nichols for England by 1815.
Colonel Nichols remained committed to the Seminole and Creek cause. He arranged a big meeting of many warriors on a hill near Chattahoochee. The meeting was to sign an agreement among themselves which would void other treaties and land distributions by Creeks to the Americans prior to the British and American treaties. The chiefs at the meeting chose my father to travel to England. He and my brother Earl left in the spring of 1815 to present these agreements to King George. As they traveled to England, we settled a new home near the springs of Wakala. Spring of 1817, my 14th year, my father returned from England and learned of the destruction at Prospect Bluff and of the resources that had been set aside for the Red Stick Offensive in Spanish Florida. My brother Earl stayed behind in England and was promised a good education. I was relieved he did not return, as those loyal to my father began attacking American soldiers and settlers that year. The battles continued. In winter of that year, my father led several attacks on American forts and settlements along the Apalachicola. That winter was very cold, and the night skies were again bright with signs from the ancestors warning of changes to come. In 1818, when I was 15 years old, a young American soldier named Duncan McCrimmon was captured in the spring by my father's forces. I witnessed him tied to a stake to be killed. His youth and fear struck a chord of sadness in me. I asked my father to spare his life. He told me it was not his decision, but gave me permission to ask the warrior who was going to kill Duncan to spare his life. Reluctantly, the warrior agreed. I asked Duncan if he would be willing to live with us. He quickly agreed, but the elders ordered that he be traded to the Spanish. Duncan was able to escape the Spanish and joined a group led by the American Lieutenant McGeever. They planned to capture my father and his allies. Lieutenant McGeever pretended to be commander of a British ship, and the Greek leaders agreed to meet with him at the ship. The Greeks were captured, and Duncan himself addressed my father to inform him that he was now a prisoner of the United States military. My sister Polly was on her way to visit the ship when the Americans fired on her canoe. At Fort St. Mark's, where Duncan had been traded to the Spanish for a barrel of whiskey, my father and his head warrior Omatlimiko were hanged. Duncan had betrayed my father to his death.
Susan was born about the time that Millie witnesses her father's death in 1818. By 1848, Susan is a mother with concerns about safety at Fort Gibson in Creek Territory, Oklahoma, where Millie also resided. It is uncertain whether Susan and Millie met.
In 1848, the Attorney General did not approve or granted the 286 Black Seminoles living at Fort Gibson freedom and provisions as part of the beginning agreement 10 years earlier to leave Florida. By 1849, my life and those of our children changed when we find we could be hunted and sold as slaves. Many free Negroes and black Seminoles are snatched, taken by slave catchers, beaten, or just disappear. McConaby has died, and John and Gwakoji, Wildcat, they sketched the maps from their other trips with places to camp. They gather information about what the weather's gonna do, trails, eatable plants, and where we could stop to harvest corn. Our two nations and the nation of Kickapoo peoples set out for Rio Grande River in November 1849 and made the Piedras Negras by July 12, 1850. 200 Muskogos Negroes, led by John, included our families and other warriors that had been from Florida with their relatives.
The forces that drove Millie and Susan from Florida to Oklahoma will also impact Anna, even as she lives in Haiti. A series of events causes her to return to Florida to secure properties and reconnect with her daughters.
Zephaniah sailed to Haiti with George, arriving to Cabaret Harbor in 1836, cultivating land for corn, sweet potatoes, yams, rice, beans, plantains, oranges, and all sorts of fruit trees. 2 years later, we sail. John Maxwell, Zephaniah's other wives and children, and George's wife, Anna Toile, for Haiti. Martha married Oran Baxter, shipbuilder and planter, and Mary became the wife of John Sammis, a merchant, sawmill owner, and planter. Both are successful white men of Scottish ancestry, and my girls will remain in Florida with them. In Haiti, there are many superb and costly old plantations. Buildings of brick and stone together with valuable mill streams and water privileges, convenient to towns purchased for a small part of what improvements would cost. Within 5 years, Zephaniah is convinced he will die soon. In 1843, he sails to New York, bidding us all farewell. He divided the land at Cabaret Creek among us and placed George in charge of the plantation. If I leave the island of liberty, I shall forfeit all rights and shares of proceeds from the properties in Haiti. Although I live in comfort on Cabaret Island, I decide to return to Florida in 1846. I am 50 years old and a widow. George dies in a shipwreck within weeks of my arrival in Florida. He was going back to Haiti from meetings in New York. Zephaniah's youngest sister contested his will, leaving most of the Florida properties and assets to me and my children. I must accept Mary's white husband, John Sammis, as my guardian. This is required by Florida law for all freed colored people. We will fight for the rights to the Florida properties and assets that are contested to get the matter settled in our favor.
Rose and her family were recorded in the 1834 census of Grand Bahama, the same year England declares the end of slavery in all British colonies.
For almost a year, we were held as prisoners in the Bahamian jail waiting for the results of the court proceedings. Nichols had paid the slave owner, especially the Spanish owner, for their slave. We hoped that proof of the payment to Mr. Papel in the East Florida would arrive and we would be free. Arguments were made for us to deliver back to the United States, but ultimately we were released into the custody of John Papal and his family as slaves again in the Bahamas. Just over 10 years since we left the plantation in East Florida, we are now working on the Papel plantation in the Bahamas. By 1825, family grew. Sally 9, 13, boy 11, and we had Sarah Ann, who is now 9, William 6, and John 4, and Charlotte is 1. Isaac was born in 1828, but a year later, both Swan and John died, and I'm pregnant again with my child. 4 years later, my little Charlotte died, and we had been moved to the Grand Bahamas, where we are registered again as slaves of the Paw family of Bahamas.
Elizabeth continued to try to find her son Ben when a man in a Cuban jail claims he is her youngest son.
By 1847, my daughter Marianne died of cholera. In that same year, my oldest son Richard sailed to Cuba in a sloop called Gig with Captain Scott. Richard worked on the wall of Cuba and heard rumor of a man named Ben living in a mountain as a slave from a colored man, Henry. It been extremely dangerous for my son to work in Cuba as a free black man. Richard gone over in the mountain looking for a brother, but could not find no information. Our plight to find Ben been published in a series of Bahamian paper and widely read in the United States and even in Cuba. An elderly man died who claimed to own Ben. Upon the man that Ben traveled to Havana to claim his freedom. Ben been required to be in custody of officials to work through a claim that he was unlawfully removed from a ship and sold into slavery as a boy. In the Bahamas, we give our deposition and work with the Cuban officials to release the man who we think indeed but my son Ben. My friend Mitchell Roberts, living with us in Andros Island, served as a colonial marine in the post at Prospect Bluff, is deposed by Bahamian authorities about Ben. He confirmed our status as free Negroes living in Northwest Florida when Ben been born. He confirmed that Captain James is considered a pirate, but not in the habit of taking boys. This information been forwarded to Cuba. More material, but uncovered addressing the stopping a marked boat by Captain James in 1819, but ain't completely clear how Ben would have been taken and sold into slavery. We so close to getting the man we think Ben free with all our work with the officials when my little Lucinda died in 1852 of cholera. 2 years later, May 1st, 1854, we received the terrible news that Ben had died in Cuba. We never know the truth about my son.
Millie recounts 20 years of her life, including the order to remove to Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears.
I was 16 years of age when I married Kocha Hobwithy, a Greek warrior. We lived in a cabin at Hickory Ground. A treaty was signed with the Americans in 1832, but this led to the Greek uprising in 1836, led by Neamatla from my father's days and young warriors. They fought against settlers who were moving onto Greek lands in large numbers. Neamatla was captured by General Thomas Jessup. In 1836, almost 5 years after the treaty was signed, the forced removal of our people began. Again, I was 33 years of age, and along with nearly 2,000 others in Alabama, my children and I were removed from our home and forced to start walking what became known as the Trail of Tears. While we were being removed from our home, my husband Gojar was serving as an enlisted soldier in a regiment of Greeks. They were helping the United States Army contain the Seminoles in Florida. We were forced to walk 12 miles a day for a while. Many days we had no food or water. In October of that year, we camped near the Mississippi River. Boats arrived to take us to Arkansas. From there, those able to walk were forced to walk to Oklahoma. The elders and sick people were taken on steamship. In winter of that year, we arrived at Fort Gibson. We had one blanket, but no food or provisions. Families quickly set about finding a place to build shelters to survive the winter. We received word that my cousin David died fighting with other Greeks. He was fighting with them to protect their lands. I feared my brother Earl would come back to extreme danger. My husband Koshar survived the fight which had taken my cousin's life. In 1837, Koshar boarded a ship to travel west as a deportee. He and 23 men from his regiment who fought on behalf of the Americans against the Seminoles all died of sickness in July on the journey to Oklahoma. When Earl returned to the United States from England, he was placed in jail and died from sickness. I was then 34 years old.
Susan and her family arrive in Mexico as John and Coacoji negotiate with the Mexican president and military forces to secure territory and resources.
Mexican authorities let us stay for a short time and settle down at the headwaters of San Antonio and San Rodrigo rivers, asking the men to help the Mexican army stop the Comanche and Apache coming into Mexican territory. John Wildcat Coacoji and Kickapoo Chief Papicoa met with the authorities and signed an agreement July 1850 that President Herrera approved October 16. In 1856, a treaty was signed separating the Seminoles from the Creek Confederacy in the United States. a bad illness started happening. They called it smallpox. It was just spreading to everybody. It affected Mexican Seminoles, killing wildcat Kuwakoji a year later. By 1861, our Seminole neighbors returned to the U.S., the new U.S. territory. The departure of Seminoles left Negroes, Muskogos, more for the Texas Raiders to attack them.
Romana's legacy in Florida seems sealed by the Witten-Jacobo family marriage, but details of Romana's life in Cuba after Biasu's sudden death are still unknown, including if Romana had children, or if Rafaela Witten and Romana's brother ever expanded their family.
Écrit journal 8, sans date. Nous en dedans ou année au soir, comme ça, depuis nous river. Seminoles, Indiens, commencé à attaquer violence sous moun nan plantation en dehors côté nous-mêmes nan. George, d'accord pour mettre comme des troupes yo dans expédition koute moun qui forcé entrer ak moun qui veille en dehors. Écrit journal numéro 9. Gouverneur a décidé pour payer George pension li, 3,000 pesos. Mais George continue écrit capitaine général Kibéa qui imposait voyer aide pour troupes qu'il a avec nous. George demande nous prendre bon soin officiers yo, ak famille yo, ak famille zami yo. Tout ça chen en pile. 6 ans qui ont passé depuis nous arriver Saint-Augustin. George demandait quelques fois pour lui bataille pour voir des espies. Il continuait à pousser pour y payer les plus pour tout effort qu'il fait. Chaque commission qu'il fait, il révoqué. Il n'a pas qu'à dormir tellement il voulait quitter le pays. Pendant ce temps, chaque jour ici a venu plus de danger. Nous réussissons à recevoir approuvé pour nous, moi-même, et quelques membres de famille à les relocaliser en Cuba devant George. Mais George, tout d'un coup, vient mourir. 14 juillet 1801. Nous faisons un arrangement pour un gros funéral pour lui. Moi-même, tout ça m'a pensé, c'est nous pas gagner un peu de provision. Et puis nous pas même connaître ça qui a fait en devant.
Prince Witten, eventually known as Juan Bautista, departs Florida with his family for Cuba in 1821 and petitions for damages from the Patriot War. He dies by 1835 before the U.S. made full payment to him. Court records indicate Anna Kingsley received her U.S. payments and she won her case against her sister-in-law to maintain Florida property and assets, enabling Anna to survive with dwindling resources with the threat of American Civil War.
By 1860, Mary and Martha have only 12 slaves from 150 slaves a year earlier. We sell off all we can to raise money for uncertain times ahead. Now 67, I have no land and only 4 slaves and dictate my last will and testament a year before we all must flee again when the American Civil War breaks out. John Sammis refused to subscribe to $10,000 worth of Confederate war bonds. His property could be confiscated and he could be hung. Union troops were stationed here briefly. We thought we would be spared, but they withdrew and we fled to New York. We returned to Fernandina, the same place we sought refuge from the Patriot War bandits 50 years later. The Civil War is over and the Union has won. And in that same year, Martha's St. Isabel plantation burns to the ground and her health is fading. John Sammis was elected as one of the 6 delegates to the Republican Party convention from Florida who voted for Abraham Lincoln to become the presidential candidate. We, the Baxters, Sammis, and Kingsley clans plan a grand homecoming in 1865 at Mary and John's home. Within a few years, several other Negro investors bought John's land, and the free Black community was expanding with land deeds to prior enslaved and free Negroes.
After Rose Purpell was able to leave the Bahamian Purpell family as a free woman, her name appears in the baptismal records of Christ Church Cathedral, New Providence. She had a son, Joseph Octavius, with Devonshire Paul, born December 5, 1835, and baptized March 16, 1836. Annette Paul Cunningham named Devonshire Paul as an executor of her will and mentioned Joseph Paul in her will, probably Joseph Octavius. Annette Paul conveyed property to Octavius Paul in 1850. Other children of Rose include a younger Rose who had a son, Robert Augustus, with Robert Henson, baptized on June 18, 1843. Born July 31st, 1842. Rose also appears in the will of Annette Paul Cunningham, referred to as a minor, considered less than 18 years old. 4 years later, in 1842, this Rose is probably Robert Augustus Henson's mother. Sarah Purpell, another daughter of Rose, had a son with Robert Hepburn in Grand Bahama. The Registrar of General Births refers to Sarah Hepburn as formerly Purpell. The child, Aaron, was born June 18, 1855. Later, Aaron Hepburn married Cecilia Roll in 1876, according to a marriage record from Grand Bahama. A birth record was found for a boy named Joshua, born to Aaron and Cecilia in 1890. Elizabeth Newton and her immediate family, including Mother Elizabeth and Sister Susan, lived on Andros Island for over 50 years. Elizabeth's mother died at 112 years, June 15, 1859, of natural decay, in the Chapelry district of St. Agnes of New Providence. Her estimated birth year was 1747. Susan Newton, Elizabeth's oldest sister, died at 90 years, November 21st, 1863, of old age in the middle and northern division of Andros Island. Elizabeth Newton, aged 80 years, died August 22nd, 1874, of natural decay in the Chapelry district of St. Agnes, New Providence, Grantstown. In her last will and testament, dated July 15, 1874, she stated, I, Elizabeth Newton Planter, of the island of Andros Island, name Thomas Dames of New Providence as executor of her will. In the will, she mentioned a son, Joseph Williams, and a daughter, Hester Dames. It is presumed that Thomas Dames was Hester's husband. Elizabeth left 5 coconut trees to another daughter, Susan. Joseph Williams was born about 1820 and at age 68 died July 30th, 1888. Elizabeth Newton mentioned a son by this name in her will. His death was registered in the northern district of Andros Island. Joseph Williams died of consumption or tuberculosis. Hester Dames was born in 1835 and at the age 64 died October 26, 1899. Hester was listed as a shopkeeper in the Chapelry district of St. Agnes, New Providence. Glory Newton was born November 15, 1854 to Susan Newton, who was not married. No father is listed. A Susan Newton also gave birth to a stillborn daughter, April 17, 1857. The birth was registered in the West District of Andros Island in the parish of St. Stephen. Bacone College, a 2-year institution dedicated to education of Native American youth, started on land where Millie Francis's log cabin once stood. According to at least one Native American administrator who worked at the college, it also had an orphanage for Native American children without parents, in which his mother was placed briefly in the 1930s. He recalled that his mother, a Coweta Creek woman originally from Alabama, was impressed by the young people she observed when she lived on the campus. During a 2025 interview about his tenure at the college, he stated that first-year Native American students would often drop out of other colleges, but those attending Bacone appeared to flourish in their studies. Emphasis on faith-based and liberal arts education attracted Native American students for over 150 years. Acclaimed Native American artists Dick West, A.C. Blue Eagle, Fred Beaver, Woody Crumbo, Joan Hill, Ruth Blalock Jones, and Jerome Tiger were affiliated with the college's esteemed art program that began in 1935. In 2019, the college hired Oglala Lakota painter Gerald Cornier to head the art department even as the college struggled financially. By 2024, Bacone had filed bankruptcy proceedings. The result of these proceedings is unknown at the time of this film. 3 children survived the late Millie Francis, and work continues to identify descendants and interview them. Details about Susan July and her one living son, Joe Coon, required extensive review of military records and third-party descriptions of John Kawaya and the work he did on behalf of his people, called the Black Seminoles. El Nacimiento de los Negros, the name of the settlement for Black Seminoles designated by the Mexican government, remains today. But there are challenges with dwindling water supplies, social services, and limited economic opportunities for young people and families who want to sustain their community and history. Nevertheless, the Nacimiento community is proud of its heritage, retaining ties with families living across the border in Texas and the United States. While Susan's journey from Florida predates the formation of the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, who served the American military at the Texas border, an interview with Dina Rodriguez revealed the information about the rich Scout history associated with the Mexican and Texas settlements of Black Seminoles, including Nacimiento, where Ms. Rodriguez's relatives still reside. Rodriguez is a descendant of Pompey Factor, who served as a Black Seminole Scout for at least 10 years, from 1870 to 1880. Factor was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1875 for saving the life of a decorated American lieutenant, John Lapham Bullis. Factor was also a farmer in Nacimiento, Mexico, and Brackettville, Texas, the location of the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery and numerous Scout sites. Russell Ben Hoover was raised by Black Seminole rancher John Murray July and his wife, Liza Daniels, in Brackettville, Texas. John Murray July was the great-grandson of Sandy July, the father of Susan July. John's great-uncle was First Sergeant Seminole Scout Benjamin Ben July. Ben Hoover began to be known only by the name Ben after John named him after his great uncle. Ben Hoover listened to the stories about the Scouts and their families as he grew. He inquired about Susan's life after the death of her husband, but no details were ever given. As an adult, Ben worked with the late William Dub Warrior, president of the Seminole Indian Scouts Cemetery Association, for 26 years to preserve Black Seminole history. Today, Ben lives near Houston, Texas. Research continues to reveal more about Susan July's final days, including her burial location. The fourth great-grandson of Zephaniah Kingsley and Anna Majijai's youngest son, John Maxwell, Emmanuel Kingsley, is a public school teacher in the Bronx neighborhood of New York City. Emmanuel spent decades assembling records and oral histories about his family told initially to him as a young boy by his older female relatives in the Dominican Republic. During an interview in May 2025, he shared memories including a photo of Osceola Kingsley, son of Zephaniah and an enslaved woman, Flora Hanahan, whom Zephaniah eventually emancipated and with whom he fathered 5 children while still married to Anna. Emmanuel also shared a painted image of his great-grandmother, Maria Perez Kingsley. Emmanuel recalled stories about the original palm trees brought from Florida to the sprawling Dominican Republic plantation. He confirmed that Anna always signed her name, Maji Jani Jai, and was extremely proud of her heritage. Members of the family still own property near the remnants of the original Kingsley settlement. It's believed the structures have never been built over. Emmanuel, together with then Park Ranger Kathy Tilford, initiated the first Kingsley family reunion, an event that gradually evolved into the festival-like Kingsley Heritage Celebration, held each February and hosted by the Timaquan Ecological and Historic Preserve. Established in 1991 near Jacksonville, the preserve encompasses the restored Kingsley Plantation, as well as other historical sites and natural areas on Fort George Island. Unfortunately, no picture or portrait exists of either Zephaniah or Anna, and no records or letters between them have been found as of the date of this film. We end at the beginning of 6 arduous journeys with Romana Jacobo, a witness to a revolution against slavery and the pervasive colonial forces that sent shockwaves around the world during an age of revolution where common men fought to secure personal freedoms and establish democratic systems on multiple continents. The last correspondence referencing Ramona was written in Spanish, October 1801, requesting support in the form of a pension from the Spanish king as the official wife of the Caudillo Moreno. She was in exile again from the country which her husband helped to liberate from slavery. The final years of Ramona's life are unknown.